Okay guys, here we go with our second set of notes on mitosis and the cell cycle. Let's get this going here. Okay, so first of all, let's go over what we're going to talk about in this set of notes. So if you're doing the outline view, you have an idea. The first thing we're going to do is review why cells need to be small and just how cells fit inside a plant. Then we'll go over the general of the cell cycle, and then we'll talk about the more specifics like interphase, mitosis, and cytokinesis. And then finally we'll talk about cancer and plants. Okay, so here we go. First question to think about is, do larger plants have larger cells? Well, we already answered this with cell size. So this large plant, like this red sequoia in California that's over 300 feet tall, does not have larger cells than this little baby tiny cactus. Okay, so this larger plant has more cells. Okay, more questions. So then if a larger plant doesn't have larger cells, then how does the plant grow and get bigger? Is it possible that the cells just keep getting larger? No, we've already answered that. Because of cell size and efficiency, a cell cannot get too big, otherwise it would not be efficient. So let's find out exactly how they go about getting bigger and growing. Okay, so can a cell just simply divide in two? That would be a solution, but the answer to that is no. And there's a couple reasons why a cell can't just simply divide into two. One is you could be left with a cell that wouldn't have any DNA. So if the cell was split in the middle and it didn't have the half that had the nucleus, the one cell would be without DNA. Probably not a good situation for that cell. Okay. Or each cell could maybe only have half of the DNA needed. Also not a good situation. If you're only given half of the instructions you need to put something together, it's not going to work out very well. So a cell must grow, repair, and replace old cells. So we have to divide them some way, and we're going to find out how. Just like you, plants need to grow. They need to repair injuries, and their cells wear out over time, so they need to replace old cells or make new cells in the spring for their new leaves and flowers and all of that other good stuff. Okay, so here we go with the cell cycle. This is a picture of the cell cycle. You can see it has a couple different phases in it, and we're going to talk about all of those phases in a little bit more detail. But first of all, the cell cycle is a period of time where a cell grows and divides to make new cells. Makes sense? We need more cells, so we need to make new ones. There's three parts to the cell cycle. The first part is interphase, which is normal cell growth. Okay? This is where a cell spends most of its time doing normal functions. We'll get into that a little bit more. Then the second part of the cell cycle is mitosis, which is where we're going to divide the nucleus. And then finally it'll wrap up with cytokinesis, which is the final cell division. Okay. So let's start with interphase, the first phase. Here's a picture of some cells under the microscope. These are plant cells, and we are pointing right here to the nucleus that is in interphase. Okay. This is the first part of the cell cycle, and like I said, it's also the longest part of the cell cycle. That's because the cell is doing all of its normal jobs, like growing, making proteins. Okay. Also during interphase, the cell is preparing to divide. This is only a short part of interphase, but it's important. During this part of interphase, the DNA is being copied, because remember from before we said we don't want a cell that has half of the DNA or no DNA, we want a full set. So in order to ensure this, the cell replicates or copies the DNA. Okay. And then it's also going to make copies of its organelles, because you want to have a full set of chloroplasts and mitochondria and Golgi bodies and all that other good stuff in there to keep the cell functioning. The next part of the cell cycle, is mitosis. Mitosis is the time when the nucleus is dividing. So that center structure there that contains the DNA. Okay. The steps in mitosis, we're going to go over basics. I'm not expecting you to remember each and every name of the step, but the basics of what happens throughout all of mitosis. Okay, so here we go. The first thing that happens in interphase, remember, is that the DNA is copied. So then in mitosis, that copied DNA, it's going to coil into structures that we call chromosomes. Okay, so little sections of the DNA will coil up into structures that are called chromosomes. Different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. Humans have 23 chromosomes from your mom and 23 chromosomes from your dad, for a total of 46. Okay, plants have all kinds of different numbers. Some of them have a few, some of them have thousands. After the DNA coils into chromosomes, then the nuclear envelope is going to dissolve or go away. This is called prophase, or the first part of the cell of mitosis. Wow, sorry. So this is an example of late prophase here, where the nuclear membrane is completely gone, and here's an example of a microscope cell with early prophase, where that membrane is just starting to dissolve. After that membrane dissolves, those chromosomes that we said were coiled DNA are going to line up in the middle of the cell. It kind of doesn't look like a very organized lineup, but the cell knows what it's doing and they are lined up. And we're going to call that metaphase. During the next stage of mitosis, the chromosomes will separate, because remember, we had DNA and we had its copy, so we need to separate those two from each other, and they're going to start to move to opposite sides of the cell. We call this anaphase. After anaphase happens, the nuclear membrane reforms. You can start to see it kind of forming around this little section here, and the chromosomes are going to start uncoiling and going back to the DNA. I didn't write that in here, but we call that phase telophase or telophase. Finally, the last part of the cell cycle is cytokinesis. This is probably the most interesting, yet the quickest phase to happen for the cell. Okay. About half of the cytoplasm and organelles are going to go to each new cell. That's very important, because remember, we said each cell has to have everything it needs to survive. And in plants, this is accomplished by this structure right here called the cell plate, which is kind of like a new cell wall. The cell plate starts to form and divides one new cell from the other new cell. Okay. At the end, we end up with two, what we call daughter cells, that are identical to each other. Okay. Now, there are some differences between how plant cells divide and how animal cells divide, like our cells. In an animal cell, the cell is able to pinch inward to split, and it gets this little piece here, this pinching in, that's called the cleavage furrow. But in plant cells, remember, we've got the cell wall surrounding the cell membrane, so the plant cell can't pinch in, so it forms a new cell plate right down the middle of the cell. Okay, so we've got cell wall here of that cell that was dividing, and then we've got the cell membrane in the green, and so a new cell wall, or the object called the cell plate, will form, causing that old cell to split into two new cells. Okay, and again, let's just refresh that the final end result, we started with one cell, and we end up with two cells that are genetically identical to that original cell. Okay, now let's talk about cancer. Cancer is the uncontrolled cell growth, or the uncontrolled growth of cells. This is normal cell division. We get one cell, we make two. Okay, and then those cells would divide and make more cells. Sometimes mutations, a gene gets turned on or off. We've all heard about different people that have had surgeries because they have a chance, or they have the gene that could lead to breast cancer. Okay, so that could happen. Environmental factors like diseases, things that we take into our bodies. Plants don't really have that issue as far as like taking things in, like carcinogens, but we do. So we're just going to talk about that is a possibility. And all of these mutations cause rapid cell division. So the cell starts dividing, that cancerous cell, and it just doesn't stop. And it just keeps going. And sometimes they mutate even further because the cells aren't going through their normal growth checkpoints. They just keep going and keep going and keep going. And then we get a buildup of mutated cells. This is a diagram of what a normal sample would look like and then what a tumor would look like. As you can see, these tumor cells are odd shaped and there's a bunch of them piled up in one area. Okay, so many of you may have not known, but plants can get cancer too. The difference is when plants get cancer, it doesn't kill them like it does animals. So it would be great if we could figure out how to control that and make sure that we don't die from cancer too. So in animals, cancer can do something that's called metastasize, which means to spread or move. Okay, so that's usually what causes animals to die from it, is they have a tumor, some of those cancer cells break off and they spread to other parts of the body, causing cancer in other parts of the body. Okay, while in plants, cancer does not spread or metastasize. Okay, and there's two main reasons for this. One is the cell wall in plants will keep the cells in one place because of that rigid cellulose cell wall. The cancer, can't move. And the other one is if it does happen to break away, plants circulate materials in different ways than animals do. Plants have a specialized type of circulation where they can send the materials that they want to exactly one part of their body. They can send materials from one leaf to another leaf, or they can send materials from the leaves to the roots on the right side of the tree and totally skip the left side. Okay, we don't do that. Our blood circulates throughout our whole body. So in that way, a plant can maybe have cancer in one area or in one part of the tree or plant, but it won't affect the whole plant. So here's a couple pictures of what cancer in plants looks like. We've probably all seen this and not known. They call it crown gall disease instead of calling it cancer, but that's really what it is. They form these ugly knots and tumor-like things. Sometimes these tumors or galls can be filled with bacteria. Sometimes they can even be infested with insect larvae. Okay, but this is what a tumor in a plant looks like. Here are a couple more tumor-like formations in plants. Okay, you can see the little tumor bubbles, I guess, for lack of a better term here. Okay. This is only 1 millimeter, so these are pretty small. But still, this is plant cancer. Okay. And then finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about plants helping animal cancer. So here are just a couple of the trees or plants that we've taken drugs from or have now made synthetic copies of those drugs that plants have had that can actually prevent or kill cancerous cells. So we've got things from the Campotheca, the happy tree, the whole group of plants in the family, the Catharanthus, which are the periwinkles, specifically the Madagascar ones, the podophyllum or the May apples. I'm not expecting you to remember these, just wanted to, kind of bring them up. And the yews. We've heard of Taxol, most likely. That's one of the most famous cancer drugs, and that comes from the Pacific yew. So we think about how many more cancer drugs are out there that plants make on their own. Okay, so finally, let's go back to those beginning questions. We asked ourselves, do larger plants have larger cells? And we answered that no. And then we said, how do plants grow and get bigger? Well, they have to add cells to their bodies. So in order to do that, they go through the cell cycle. Okay? And why, finally, can't cells just keep getting bigger? And we know from our cell size that for a cell to be efficient, it must remain small. There needs to be enough DNA to control the cell, and there also needs to be enough surface areas for the amount of volume that's there. So there is a limit to the cell size. Hopefully you now know a little bit more about the cell cycle and cancer, and I will talk to you later. Thank you. Goodbye.